Okay, we're going to go through how to build your complex models of disease. I'm going to start with giving you a little bit of the background information about why we're building such complex models and where this all is coming from. If you're familiar with the concept of the life course health development model, then you could probably just listen to this at 2 times the speed or skip through the first part if you're not interested. So again, we'll start with the models. Looking at how we think about health and medicine and how we have thought about it throughout the years, a lot of people, going into medicine have this concept that we are still working with a biomedical model, but that was, like 100 years ago. And that was really built out of germ theory. It was built out of our anatomical knowledge. It was built out of, Mendelian genetics. But when you look at biomedical models, they're very linear, right? They're simplistic, they're reductionistic, they're mechanistic, and it really doesn't get the whole concept of what health and disease means. And so, this kind of model that we generally use in certain situations, right? It creates health inequities and it's not the most efficient model, but something like this would still be used like, you break your arm and you need surgery and it needs to be fixed. Even though that could even be made in a more complex model, we still at some points in the medical system focus on that end result. And that is like that biomedical part, that very molecular organ, and then this disruption with the cellular structure, and then how do we fix it? But we know that disease is much more complex. And so as science continued to evolve, so we had the social epidemiology, we have behavioral influences, and that helped us expand our model to the biopsychosocial model. And I think we all have heard about this, in med school, throughout training, but even this is really kind of outdated, even though it did give us more of a hierarchy and it gave us more dynamic like systems explanations for disease. It's still not quite the updated model. And so it does target some of the root causes of disease. It does lead to sustainable interventions, but another model that grew out of this was more of a social ecological model. And this is really looking at like more complex system science, and we'll kind of go through this, but this is the key to really remember. Let's see. So the individual, right, lives in maybe a family, a household, or has relationships, right? So here's the social part of it. But then they live in the community, and that influences health as well. And then the society that in which they live in also influences health. So, so keeping that in mind, the science evolved, and we got more life course epidemiology. We got information about epigenetics, that Mendelian genetics just doesn't work for human diseases anymore. We've gone way beyond that, right? So now we understand epigenetics, we understand complex system science. And so really what grew out of this was something called like the life course health development model. This is a really complex model. So we don't expect your final model to be as complex looking at as this one, but I do want to explain the complexity just so you're aware. And if you have that artistic flair that you can build a complex model, then go for it. So I'll explain this as we go along because I think that the video actually does a little bit better job. So let's stop here. The individual, right? The individual child has a health status, but the family also impacts the child. That makes sense, right? At this point. Now, the thing about this is that the individual also impacts the family. And so what does what do I mean by this? Well, if you get this mismatch between parent and child in terms of you maybe have a parent-child relationship that looks one way with a pretty calm kid, but you get a fussy kid, a really colicky kid, or the parents are stressed or depressed, that's going to lead back and influence the health of the child, but the child's also going to influence the health of the parents as well. And those things are dynamic. And so you really can't really understand health and the concept of health, especially within the social ecological model, without having that back and forth dynamic interaction. So then we have the community, same thing, right? The family can affect the community can affect the family. You have the physical environment, you have policy. And so all of these things play a role, and they're interacting at every single level of the health model. And so then moving right along. So you have this dynamic relational environment. And then you have these time-dependent and time-specific pieces. So let's talk about that for a minute. So time-specific pieces, what does that mean? Well, we know that there are certain windows of vulnerability within a child's life, right? So, and the easiest way to think of this is thinking about like environmental toxins, right? So if you're exposed to a particular environmental toxin during your prenatal environment and your prenatal development, that might have significantly more impact on your health trajectory and your outcomes than if you're a college student and you're also, exposed to that environmental toxin for the first time versus if you're 80. Right. And so if that toxin is alcohol, you can see how that makes a huge difference in the health trajectory. And so that's time specific, this like biological behavioral conditioning. We also know that something like stress, right, can have epigenetic alterations on your stress response system and your ability to turn off that stress response system, particularly if you are exposed to like high levels of cortisol in utero or in the early childhood life. And then we have time dependent or that cumulative effect. And that would be like stress throughout the lifetime and the cardiovascular impacts of, that sympathetic nervous system being activated throughout a lifetime. And that's that wear and tear allostatic load concept. And so that's what those two things are really talking about. And so moving on, then we have this, we've already talked about the dynamic relational environment, but you also have these different adaptations that occur in response to all of these different environmental determinants. And so whenever we're talking about behavioral adaptation, we're talking about, those behavioral responses, right? Like those adaptive mechanisms that might be maladaptive in a different context. And so that might have to do, again, with the amount of nurturing that you are exposed to early in life and how that affects, how you act later on in life. You also have those physiologic adaptations. So I mentioned the epigenetic programming of the stress response system. And so that's the HPA axis and the autonomic nervous system. But you also have these impacts on your metabolic processes, such as, when we look at things like the Dutch hunger winter and, or even discrimination during pregnancy, and we look at the metabolic programming of the fetus, it looks like later on, the fetus is programmed to hold on to more nutrients. And so we can look at these like historic and events as kind of a experimental system that shows us how these things get programmed and these adaptations that then become maladaptive occur. And then you also have like the developmental adaptation, and that's what we're used to talking about in pediatrics, so I won't spend a whole lot of time right here. And so one of the beauties of this model is that health isn't just the end point, right? Because you can have all of these different trajectory affecting impacts. So say we start off here, preconception level of health is relatively high. And then, we have a high social status, positive parenting, which, bumps our trajectory to a higher health status, whatever that means. But then we live in a food desert, and then that decreases it. And then, other things like we have a great work-life balance. So health is not just like the end result. It's actually like the developmental process, and you have a trajectory. And of course, the most efficient efficient things that we can do will probably be early in childhood, but you can always improve it or decrease the health status at any point in life. And so this is actually a very positive change than most of the models that we've used in the past. And so that's the big model, and it looks really, really intimidating, but it's not. It's stuff that you already understand. It's just this social ecological model with this time and, biological, behavioral, and developmental adaptation. So it all should make sense and not be quite so intimidating. And this, again, is, the very, very complex model. Here is, again, you can change the directory or the trajectory of all these different health statuses throughout life. The slides include some of the core principles, which you're, free to look at. So the framework that we're going to have you use is kind of both the social ecological model and then the life course, but then the whole framework is the life course health development model. And, you can kind of look at it from like zooming in, which for this particular assignment, you don't have to zoom in as much, but, if you want to reinforce your knowledge about the biological pathophysiology, go for it. You can include that in your model if you want to, but really we want you to zoom out. And this is going to be the most important part of it, because you might be able to talk about individual behavioral risk factors, to talk about, some of the social interactions or the household risk factors, but we really want you to get out to the community, societal, and ecosystem risk factors. So I'll go back. So as you explore and as you build your model, we really, really want you to take this opportunity to identify determinants that you're not familiar with, that you didn't necessarily connect to particular health outcomes in the beginning. And so we do want you to learn something from this and really focus on historical, focus on policy, focus on, cultural, and I'm not talking about the culture of, the individual who is having the health issue. I'm talking about societal norms that, lead to oppression and marginalization, even, clinical norms that lead to the same. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute.